We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Secrets and Spies present Espresso Martini.
Welcome everybody to episode 3 of Espresso Martini with myself, Chris Carr, and Matt Fulton. Matt, how are you? And welcome to the show.
Doing good. Glad to be back.
Excellent. Well, it's good to have you back on. So today we have a jam-packed episode. November, a bit like October, was a very busy month and in the world of espionage, geopolitics, and intrigue. And so today we're going to kick things off looking at the Crimean Bridge explosion that happened on the 8th of October 2022, just in case anybody listens to this in a couple of years and they don't know which year it was. The explosion was a result of an attack conducted by Ukrainian forces, and the New York Times have done an excellent special covering that attack titled How Ukraine Blew Up the Bridge by James Glanz and Marco Hernandez. So just quick key points from the article. So the attack took place at 6:07 a.m. and it was timed during a low traffic period. The attack sadly killed 4 people and it was a critical moment for the war. It dealt an embarrassing blow to Vladimir Putin because that bridge had been a sort of prestige project and it had been a critical strategic asset and kind of potent symbol for its connection to Crimea. The bridge was despised by Ukrainians and there was huge celebrations after the attack. Russia quickly restored rail and road traffic after the explosion, but satellite images taken by a company called Planet indicated that large sections of the roadway were still missing. After the attack, there was a lot of speculation of how it was done and by whom. Everything from drone ships to suicide bombers to rogue FSB officers have been blamed for the attack. Explosive experts who've reviewed the imagery of the blast agreed that the damage was most likely caused by a truck bomb, as Ukrainian officials have said, rather than a missile fired by a boat beneath the bridge. Even though I don't know how you found this, Matt, but when looking at the CCTV, it's weird because I look at the truck and then there's this sort of explosion. I don't know why I feel like I need to see the explosion coming from the truck because I'm so primed from all these movies I watch. But I think with a CCTV camera, because it's such a bright flash, it kind of overexposes the image. But it kind of still, I don't know, it looks like the explosion is still sort of coming from underneath. So it's an interesting one, that one. And the BBC also, in the early days after the attack, kind of showed some images of boats underneath the bridge just as the explosion went off. So, Matt, you picked this article out. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, to your point about the source of the explosion, I mean, it definitely seems to look. I'm watching a clip of the CCTV footage right now. It's embedded in the New York Times article, and it on the one side, like you see the truck going up the span of the bridge, and then it detonates, and then on the other side, sort of like a split screen, the section of CCTV footage that's pointing down at like the pylons under the bridge from the rail bridge that goes parallel to the roadway. And it does look like there's some movement in the water in like the second before the explosion. And I think I recall when this first happened, there was a lot of talk online about, some sort of an underwater drone or something, that could have caused it. So I don't know. I mean, it does sort of, just from what they have here, look like it was a vehicle-borne IED, a VBIED that did it. But what sort of struck me is how it was done. I mean, so the implication that this New York Times article is getting at, if the bomb was delivered by a truck, was that it would have been a suicide bomber behind the wheel, because it talks about how where the bomb went off, it was sort of just before the roadway arcs up into the span that shipping would pass under, right? And if the truck had gone on for another minute or two before detonating, it would have affected some of the expansion joints that could have brought down that whole section of the roadway and totally severed the bridge. I mean, right now there's one section of the roadway leading into Crimea that's down in the sea, and the resulting explosion damaged a fuel train that was on the adjacent bridge, and that went up in flames. But yeah, if so, the logic is that if it was a suicide bomber behind the wheel, and to be clear, we don't know.
Yeah, there isn't much information.
No. And I even looked outside this article and couldn't find, I mean, yeah, there's tons of like use of speculation, but in terms of like actual information as to if it was a suicide bomber, we don't know. But if there was a suicide bomber behind the wheel, you think they would have waited another minute or two before detonating to, really damage the bridge. So it's the question of, was there a suicide bomber behind the wheel, or did the person driving the truck not know that there was a bomb in it? Which, to me, the interesting question, I mean, either scenario is interesting to me, that, the Ukrainians would use a live human being, committing suicide as a tactic.
Because that's more synonymous with the Middle East, unfortunately, because the Iran-Iraq war back in the 80s, where that tactic kind of started, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's famously, culturally now, yeah, like to your point, we really associate it with Islamic sort of based terrorism, right? It has a sort of religious kind of connotation and undertone to it that allows these people to be motivated to kill themselves for a greater cause, which would be their religion or something. But I mean, that's not always been the case. Look at Japanese kamikaze pilots during World War II, where that's rooted in sort of a cultural nationalism kind of thing. I can certainly see that being the case among some in the ranks of the Ukrainian armed forces right now. You're talking about a war for their national survival. I mean, yeah, you definitely sort of have those passions, those emotions that come up in this situation that would lead someone to volunteer to drive a bomb over a bridge and set it off. The other question then for me is I want to be careful with how I phrase this here, because I don't want to suggest that the U.S. or other Western intelligence services are like directing the Ukrainians to do this. But an attack of this scale, I mean, we're talking about the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is like the sole land route between mainland Russia and Crimea, right? Huge strategic, symbolic target, which is why Putin went nuts and has been lobbing cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities since then, right? Basically, explicitly as revenge for this attack. So if the Ukrainians were going after that high level of a target, it sort of belies my expectations that we wouldn't at least be aware that it was happening to some degree. I'm not saying like we would provide the training or the technical expertise to get it done, but it's hard for me to believe that we wouldn't know in advance to some degree. So then if we did, purely for conversation's point, if we did know in advance that the Ukrainians were going to hit this bridge, how do we, sitting at Langley or Vauxhall Cross, how do we feel about the Ukrainians employing suicide bombers?
Yeah.
I know we definitely would not feel okay about sending someone over this bridge with a bomb in the truck that they weren't aware of, To me, that's an interesting moral, ethical question that, how would Western intelligence services feel about this kind of a thing? I mean, we have sort of lines in the sand that we don't cross, famously the CIA has policies where they won't use journalists or clergy or medical workers as agents or as unofficial cover, because that sort of seems like you don't want to sully those businesses, those people,
puts those people in risk. Yeah.
Right. It makes everyone targets. So we there are some exceptions where that rule has been bent, but generally we stay away from that, and I think employing suicide bombers would be one of those things that would be a real something that we have issue with, even if there are Ukrainians in their armed forces and their security services who are willing to do it. I think that would still give us pause. And that's what's so interesting about this to me, the question of, was there someone behind the wheel who did this? And it seems like there was.
And it's interesting that usually, when with suicide bombing in the Middle East, they usually then celebrate the bomber.
Yes.
And they're hailed as a hero. And there's none of that.
No.
It's just a mystery, which is a bit. My my spied are. I'm still not 100% convinced it was a truck bombing, but I'm not an expert. I wonder if this is all cover for the Ukrainians maybe having underwater drone technology or something that could have done it, or it was some sort of weird special ops mission where they rigged explosives under the bridge somehow. But I could be completely wrong there. It's just, I don't know, because the suicide attacks are so rare, almost non-existent, because there haven't been any other suicide attacks this style in the Ukrainian war that we know of, or as far as I know of. Obviously, there might be missions that lead to mass death, or people might participate in a mission not knowing if they're going to come back or not, but they haven't. Somebody isn't getting into a truck and laden with explosives and then going over a bridge. It's a bit odd. The other question then is whether the other slightly icky one is whether they planted a bomb in some guy's truck, and unbeknown to the truck driver, they were driving along with quite a lot of explosives. But the only thing slightly against that is, I believe the sheer volume of explosives in the truck would have been hard to hide from someone, I suspect. But so it's a very bizarre one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what you said sort of brings to mind in the early days of the war, the stories about, was it the Ghost of Kiev, a Ukrainian MiG fighter pilot who was, single-handedly defending the skies over Kiev, which I think turned out to be sort of, like an urban legend. There wasn't a singular fighter pilot who was still, fending off the Russian Air Force. But, a story like that, or the defenders of Snake Island, Russian warship, go fuck yourself. Sorry for the explicit label of this podcast now. But this story that came out early in the war that turned out to not be entirely true. I think some of the people on Snake Island survived the Russian attack.
Yeah, they did. They were kept prisoner, weren't they?
Yeah. But these stories that, galvanize the national psyche, that you think if there was a Ukrainian soldier or someone from the Ukrainian security forces who volunteered to do this, I think the Ukrainians would have some sort of benefit in coming out and saying, this is who this person is. Aren't they a hero? In the same way that, suicide bombers in the Middle East happens all the time. On the alternative, if the truck was some sort of a cover for a underwater drone, I mean, I think the Ukrainians have demonstrated, even in the last couple of months, pretty adept abilities in that area. I mean, there was a really great video of an attack on the Russian naval base in Sevastopol. That was an underwater drone, and you can see it. It looks crazy, this video, but it's from the drone, which is down like almost under the water line. It looks like one of like those drug submarines, that like you would catch in the Caribbean.
Yes, the good old narco subs. Yeah.
Right. It looks like one of those, and it's just like right on the water line, and you see these Russian Mi-8 helicopter gunships flying overhead trying to take this thing out, and like you see bullets going into the water and stuff around it. So they're definitely capable of this kind of thing. Yeah, it's the other interesting point to me is the truck was coming from, I don't know if this proves either way or suggests something more either way, but it's interesting to me that the truck was coming from Krasnodar, from mainland Russia, not from Crimea. I mean, the Ukrainians certainly have cells operating inside Russia. I mean,
because there's been some sabotage attacks, haven't there, and other things.
Dugin's daughter, the car bombing that killed Alexander Dugin's daughter a while ago. I feel, going back to my thought that if it was an underwater drone attack, then I think the likelihood that like JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, or the British Special Boat Service or something were more operationally involved if that was the case.
One other interesting thing, just in the BBC article that's published like the day after, a few days after the attack, where they mention the underwater drones, they quote a Ukrainian official, Mikhail Podolak, who was the head of President Zelensky's office, and he claimed the explosion was caused by a truck, but it was due to infighting between the FSB and Russian military contractors. So that's another interesting little spin on it.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, we'll go into it a little bit. There's been reports of infighting in the FSB, and certainly a a spooky contact of me off air speculated that there could well be some sort of FSB involvement with the bridge attack. So yeah, I don't know, it's an interesting one, that one. Whether they were trying to do like I hate to use the phrase now because it gets misquoted so often, but a false flag sort of operation where they were trying to blow something up to blame it on the Ukrainians. I'm not convinced that is the case, but it's an interesting thing in the fact that Ukrainian official kind of tried to kind of claim that. But I think, again, that might be some sort of psyops trying to make the Russians think that they can't trust each other. I don't know. It's an interesting one.
If I remember correctly, after the attack, Putin gave the FSB, charged the FSB with security over the bridge. They were not in charge of security over the bridge beforehand. I believe that was the border guards. In 10 to 15 years from now, someone's going to write the definitive history of Western intelligence services sort of working behind the scenes during this war, and it's going to win all the Pulitzers.
Yeah, and I hope that person will be a guest on this show. Unless we write that book. I don't know.
Yes.
Maybe we need to get working on it.
Maybe. Work those contacts. Yeah. No, there is so much going on here that we don't know. I mean, you see fires at all kinds of Russian industrial facilities all over the country, and it's not even in like Belgorod and stuff, like right over the Ukrainian border. We're talking stuff happening in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, way out in the Russian Far East, multiple time zones away from Ukraine where this stuff is happening. There is a very large, concerted, covert effort to bring the war to Russian doorsteps that we don't know about right now, and to be honest, we shouldn't know about right now. But one day in the future, that story will definitely be told.
Yeah, it'll be a very interesting one. One last note. After the attack, the Russian security services put out a famous X-ray of a truck, but that X-ray does not match the truck on the bridge. So that was a funny little extra tidbit to this story that struck popped out.
That might lend some credence to your Russian infighting theory, if they can't even get their story straight.
Yeah, you never know. It's an interesting one. There definitely appears to be some sort of infighting going on in Russia, as we'll chat about in a minute. Yeah, it's the thing with these events. They're always open to a lot of speculation, and there's healthy speculation and unhealthy speculation.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping we stay on the healthy side of speculation with it. I think we are. So
yeah, I think we're doing pretty good.
It certainly wasn't an alien beam weapon or something like that. So
no, not a Jewish space laser.
No. Apparently they're quite popular these days.
They are over here, yeah. Yeah.
Oh dear. Well, talk about FSB infighting. So there's a great article titled "Civil War Among Putin Allies" by Isabel van Brugen from Newsweek. And apparently there's a whistleblower within the FSB who's been leaking emails that reveal a civil war going on among Putin allies, as well as anger and discontent within the ranks of the FSB. So maybe there are bridge bombers in the ranks of the FSB. Who knows? And this whistleblower has been dubbed the Winds of Change. And this whistleblower sends regular email reports to a Russian exile called Vladimir Oseshkin. Oseshkin is a Russian human rights activist who runs an anti-corruption website called gulagu.net. And in Winds of Change's most recent email, I'm assuming it must be coming to a conclusion, these emails, because there's an article about it now, but his most recent, or his or her most recent email from November, they detail inner turmoil and conflict within the Kremlin, predicting an inevitable civil war, and that Russia will soon descend into the abyss of terror as people grow increasingly tired of the war. The whistleblower then focuses on Yevgeny Prigozhin, who's a Putin ally and founder of the mercenary outfit, the Wagner Group. And so yes, he's sort of been recently seen as a potential successor to Putin, which may or may not be making Putin nervous, and may or may not mean his life might be coming to a swift conclusion soon, especially if he gets offered a dodgy cup of tea. So there's definitely something going on within the FSB and the sort of top level of the Kremlin. So Matt, did you have any sort of thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I think the important thing here is to keep in mind, like, when this whistleblower sort of talks about a quote-unquote inevitable civil war, it's sort of important to define what one means by the term civil war. Yeah. I mean, like you've seen, there were images posted in sort of the earlier days of the war that sort of talked about areas that are like culturally quote-unquote Russian, like areas around Moscow, and then farther east into the Urals and stuff that are more ethnic minorities.
Yeah.
And sort of talks about, this is Russia and this is not Russia, basically saying that the Russian Federation should be broken up. I think that is such insane wish casting. Like, I mean, I've explained this to friends of mine who've asked about it. And like I said, the balkanization of the Russian Federation would be a geopolitical catastrophe, the likes of which I don't think we've seen since like the 19th century. It's not something that anyone wants. I mean,
No.
you might think you want the big Russian baddies to go away, but you don't want Russian splintering into an open civil war.
Yeah.
That would be a complete nightmare for everyone involved.
And there are enough 90s movies that show us why that's a bad thing.
Yes, exactly. But if we're talking about a civil war between the security services, the Siloviki, as they're known inside Russia, I mean, I think as the war continues to not go well for Putin, and you see a lot of people in these inner circles, like Evgeny Prigozhin, who's famously called Putin's chef, who runs the Wagner group of mercenaries.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a guy who has been going around a lot to Russian prisons and recruiting people to come and fight for this mercenary group in Ukraine. Really crazy stuff. I mean, even by the standards of like Putin crazy, this guy's pretty nuts.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the way he has publicly presented himself at a lot of these pro-Russian rallies in the country over the past couple of months, it sort of suggested I don't want to say a presidential campaign, but it had those kind of trappings, those kinds of trappings that someone who is looking to position themselves as a possible successor to Putin, if something unfortunate were to befall him in the future, either a coup or some sort of a medical event or whatever, he could be a possible alternative. And I mean, if there's something you want to not be in Russia, you would think it's a plausible challenge to Putin's reign.
No, it doesn't end well.
No, it does not. I mean, the other thing to consider here is that there's no set procedure of what happens in Russia if Putin is out of the picture. I mean, there's no set line of succession. There's no protocol for that. I mean, I dealt with this in Active Measures in the first volume of that series, and I'm sort of still dealing with it in writing the second, sort of seeing hypothetically, the ultra powerful strongman Russian president, if he suddenly disappears, what happens afterwards? And it gets pretty. It would get pretty ugly.
And Putin's created that situation because, am I right, when he came to power back in, was it 1999, wasn't it? Early 2000s. He obviously over time changed the constitution so he can now, because he was only supposed to be a 2-term president, and that 2 terms have gone on a very long time now, with a brief interlude. And, at the moment he's set for being president till he drops dead. And this is one of the other motivations of that whistleblower. The winds of change, because they were quite distressed by the fact that there is no clear line of succession. There is no sort of democracy, good or bad, in Russia. And they only see a negative outcome, which, is not hard. It's hard not to see a negative outcome, because I've been speculating on this myself privately, just thinking that if you do end up in a situation where Russia gets into a civil war, the scary scenario, which again is from these 90s movies, is the nuclear weapon question and who gets hold of them. You've got a situation where there's going to be a lot of people who are probably not going to get paid for a while, who might start selling stuff, it's sort of becoming the sum of all fears again. So it's I mean, it sort of reminds me of what was it Louis said during the French Revolution, "After me the deluge." And I think as despotic and truly evil Putin is, there is at least undeniably one person in charge of that country, and sometimes that there is a silver lining in that. The Pentagon, through the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the DTRA, has spent a lot of money since the 90s, since the fall of the Soviet Union, ensuring the security
of Russian nuclear weapon systems. So just like that, I mean, like we have, so let's say there was a coup in Pakistan. This was a concern back in the 2000s after 9/11. If there was an Islamist coup in Pakistan, JSOC had contingency plans on the shelf to jump in and seize Pakistan's nuclear arsenal. Like there's a video clip of a Little Bird helicopter, very small helicopter, landing on top of a semi trailer for an exercise. And like, you wonder what that's for. That's to seize Pakistan's nuclear weapons if there was a coup. But their arsenal is small enough that can sort of be managed in an operation. But you're talking with Russia, thousands of warheads spread across this vast country. I don't know how we keep a lid on that.
And the nuclear submarines.
And the submarines.
With a conversation with a pacifist friend of mine who's now become quite up for just sending one nuke to Russia. It's like, yeah, that's a really good idea. One will be fine. No, it won't, because there'll be a retaliation.
Because it'll definitely just stop at one.
Yeah, exactly. And so, oh gosh, bless them. But so to my point to them was, one of the issues with the nuclear weapons is you've got all these subs, the deterrent at sea out there, and we have them too. Hence why there's this continual argument every few years about the future of Trident that comes up, and a lot of people kind of on the left side of the political spectrum really hate Trident and think we don't need it. And about sort of 11 years ago, during a general election, was it Nick Clegg, who was up for being Prime Minister at the time, and he became the Deputy Prime Minister. He famously said, we don't need Trident anymore because the only threat is terrorism. And it's like, well, there's no such thing as a singular threat. And thank God he wasn't really Prime Minister, and Trident did manage to continue its funding, because I think now we live in the world where we really do need that nuclear deterrent, because we want to dissuade people from leading using them. But there we go. So I think there are subs out there right now that have Russia's nuclear arsenal on them.
Yep.
And one thing Putin has done well, because Russian forces have been recently seen as a bit clapped out and ill-equipped, and there's a lot of corruption, but the one thing he does seem to have done really well with is the submarine service. Partly because of when he became president, he had the Kursk disaster as one of his early things, and also he had a relative of his who was in the submarine service, and probably Putin understands the significance of gunboat diplomacy, and submarines are the way to do it these days. So I believe the submarine service is in pretty good nick, and they've got the Belgorod, which can send out these sort of small submarines that can do special missions, and probably likes Nord Stream pipelines and other things too. So we should never underestimate Russian nuclear weapons and the submarine services of the world. So scary stuff, really, because this is the thing that always freaked me out about the war in Ukraine, and then with it going so badly for Putin, is it kind of, there is no guarantee of a logical conclusion or an orderly conclusion, because I think we are, maybe like because of World War II and stuff, it's still a part in the popular kind of imagination of like this sense of orderly endings. And obviously politicians probably work very hard to try and create an orderly ending to things. But in reality, there generally aren't. Wars are usually just abandoned and then express themselves in different ways later.
You think of that line from Apocalypse Now, one day this war is going to end. I mean, that's true of every war. One day it's going to end. And you think at the end of it, there will still be a Russian Federation sharing a very large border with Ukraine. Like these two countries have to exist side by side. And I'm not saying this to get in like some kumbaya. Can't we all just get along? Like, that's not my point here, but it's just the reality that however this war is going to end, like it's like the US and Canada right there next to each other, they have to exist in the same space. So how you find an end where that happens, and often wars don't end; they just stop, or they go into some sort of a frozen sort of twilight world in between, which is sort of how much of Eastern Ukraine was until last February.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring something up quickly, because I got a bit of a bollocking in one of my reviews recently, because I expressed a concern about how post the war, was
this for the podcast?
Yeah. So post the war, hopefully some sort of judicial process that holds Russians to account for what they've done. And I maybe didn't make that clear in the episode where I got a bollocking. But I'm concerned slightly that if the war, one conclusion to the war is, Russia's defeated, the international community kind of get involved, and there's some sort of process, and Russia have to pay reparations for the damages that they've caused, and rightly so. But we don't want to end up repeating the mistake of World War One. We don't want then, right, because Putinism, I think, is one of the key things that's been bubbling away for the last 20 years. And the international community needs to find a way, because Putinism, in a way, is sort of saying that the West is all evil and constantly trying to undermine Russia. And the problem is, if we've already given them a whole load of sanctions, but if they have 20 years of just pure sanctions, it could end up in a kind of World War II situation again, like a Nazi Germany again. Now, one could argue we're kind of in Nazi Germany with them now, but I think it could get worse. And there needs to be some sort of way to bring kind of Russia, post the war, post justice, back into the international fold in a positive way, because otherwise this will happen again. There'll be more death, more destruction, more potential World War III apocalyptic scenarios. So I hope I've made that clearer now in my fear, because that person who left that comment, I'm sorry, I didn't make it clear enough, but I was speculating because I'm concerned for the future, because I don't want to see this happen again. And it probably will.
Yeah, no. You think about a situation like to your point, Weimar Germany after World War One, that the winning powers of World War One just ran Germany into the ground through reparations, forced surrender of its overseas colonial territories, absolutely sort of created that situation within Germany that allowed Nazism to flourish. In the same way, I mean, I think you also just don't want a situation in Russia like we had at the end of the Cold War, where the central government just collapses and the whole country is just looted by gangsters for 10 years until a former KGB spy comes along and says, hey, I'm going to get rid of these guys for you, and I'm going to bring order to the country, but, you're not going to have any democratic sort of rights. You want to avoid that situation as well. I mean, honestly, I think we should have had, in the 90s, early 90s, we should have had a Marshall Plan for the former Soviet space.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
And that is a very unique missed opportunity that we did not do more to bring the former Soviet space into the club of prosperous democratic Western nations like we did with East Germany after unification.
So we need to, post justice, post all the things that need to be done, but they do need to, somebody somewhere needs to think about how to bring Russia back into the fold in a positive way so this doesn't happen again. But
and I think we also need to set our expectations realistically. I mean, there's a lot of people on Twitter who are all about sort of, stringing Putin up by a lamppost. And as lovely as that would be to see, you have to be realistic about what this war is going to look like when it eventually ends. Are there scores of Russian officers who deserve to be dragged into The Hague? Absolutely. Are we ever going to see them there? No.
Well, we didn't even see all the Nazis tried, did we? Some of them went on to help with the rocket program and other things too. So
right. Yeah, they end up in Syria and stuff. Just the idea that you will see senior Russian leaders, or I would say any leaders for that matter, brought to justice in The Hague in that sort of a nice tied off way that, yes, justice has been done. It's not going to happen. And that's not to say that I wish that was not the case. They deserve to be brought to justice in that matter. But it's not going to happen. We're not talking about the former Yugoslavia. We're not talking about some small sub-Saharan African country. We're talking about the largest country in the world with thousands of nuclear warheads.
Yeah, and this can't be underestimated. And again, to that review I got, unfortunately, superpowers can't be ignored. I know sometimes we overly focus on superpowers, but there's a reason for that, because they possess nuclear weapons and they have a lot of influence, and generally 9 times out of 10 most regional intrigue usually goes back to a superpower, whether it be America, China or Russia, or even some of the Middle Eastern sort of, whether it be Iran or Saudi Arabia. Usually one of those key countries has its sort of has some sort of influence on some of the events that are going on in some way or another, usually. So no, I agree with you, Matt. I think I as much as I'd love to see Putin hang, and it might be a civil war. Who knows?
He might.
He might, or there might be some sort of way where there's a more positive president in Russia, and somehow part of one of the deals for, I don't know, reintegrating Russia is that Putin has to be tried in The Hague. It could happen, and we'd love to see it, but I don't know if it will happen. So, yeah.
Here's my prediction, real quick, and then maybe we can move on.
Okay, cool.
My prediction is if Putin is hung from a lamppost one day, and I think the chances are he will sort of live out the rest of his days in a dacha along the Black Sea. But if he is hung from a lamppost one day, it will not be by our hand. It will be because Russians did it themselves. That's the only way it's going to happen.
Yeah, and that's the way it should happen, really. So,
yeah. To be honest.
Yeah, definitely. Because otherwise, again, blowback. the more superpowers do influence local events, usually the more blowback that comes in the end somewhere at some point, and somebody else has to pay for it. So it's better that Russians do it, and then maybe it can become some sort of warning to future generations. But there we go. So we'll continue on a little bit of our Russian theme.
Yes.
There's a really great story that was in Yahoo News by Michael Weiss, who I admire greatly, and I would love to get him on the podcast. And
he's so smart.
He is. Honestly, I've been
emailed with him before.
Oh, have you? Oh, cool. God, yeah, I'd love to get him on the show. I've tried emailing him about this article, but I haven't heard anything yet. So, Michael, if you're listening,
he's very busy.
Yeah, no, he is. Honestly, that guy. He's really on it. If you want to find somebody who really, apart from Bellingcat, if you want to see somebody who's really on the tails of Russian intelligence, Michael Weiss is the man to check out. And he got exclusive access recently via Yahoo News to chat with a former Russian GRU officer called Artem Zinchenko. Did I get that right? Artem Zinchenko? That's a rather easier Russian name than some of the others. My Russian's a bit rusty these days. So he did an exclusive interview with this defector and intelligence officers in Estonia who helped him defect. And the article was a great profile on the Estonian intelligence officer who originally arrested Zinchenko and eventually turned him. If you want to find a real-life George Smiley, he is currently in Estonia. Yeah. And Estonia is pretty much been a sort of front line against Russia for some time now. It's been an awful lot of Russian espionage activity.
A lot of cyber attacks.
Yeah. And Edward Lucas talks a lot about Estonia. And so, with Zinchenko, he was the first Russian GRU agent to be arrested in Estonia and then traded back to Moscow. And then years later, he went and defected back to the country that had arrested him, which is quite unique. One other interesting note, Zinchenko at the time of his arrest was running a member of Estonian intelligence as a mole for the GRU. So, he was definitely up to no good on behalf of the Russians. His decision to defect was as much motivated by the Kremlin's brutality at home and abroad, and he has family members in Ukraine, and so he, again, like a few other sort of Russian intelligence officers allegedly, are all quite upset about the war in Ukraine, and so we are starting to see more defections. There's probably a lot more people now are becoming assets for Western intelligence services because of the war in Ukraine. And I hark back to my favourite Russian spy, Oleg Gordievsky. He turned in 1968 after the clampdown on the Prague Spring. He was so disgusted by it, as were some other intelligence officers, that he started making moves to Danish intelligence at the time, and then eventually became MI6's sort of top source in the Russian intelligence services. So really great article. And the article's titled Russian Spy Defects, Yahoo News. So it's pretty easy to find, and we'll put a link in the show notes. Matt, did anything stand out for you with this story?
Yeah, this is a great breakdown here. I mean, Michael Weiss was invited to Tallinn, the capital of Estonia,
yeah, lucky man,
by the head of Estonia's FBI, essentially the capo, and was sort of given this information as like an exclusive, that they had turned this GRU officer. And great, and compares the head of capo to George Smiley in a great sort of anecdote there. I don't know. I mean, to your point about like Gordievsky after the Prague Spring, a lot of historically, I think some of the best spies have been recruited or turned after a, unique sort of moral catastrophe by their home countries. Like I'm thinking of Oleg Penkovsky, who during the Cuban Missile Crisis fed a lot of information to the CIA, which probably averted a nuclear war. All these sort of best spies historically, it happens because they become disillusioned on a deep moral level with their home countries. And you definitely see that here with the Russians post-Ukraine. And I'm sure this guy Zinchenko is not the only one. He's definitely not the only one. I mean, I'm sure there's walk-ins and defections all over Western Europe that have happened since February, many of whom we don't know about. And yeah, that's an issue with these sort of wars of conquest that just so go beyond the pale of what people are able to accept, that it's hard to recruit people to spy for you. Like if you're the GRU, if you're the Russians, it's hard to recruit people to spy for you after this. At the same point, it's hard to keep your people from walking out the door.
No, indeed. And actually, one other interesting thing just about recruitment, I mean, is human intelligence is getting harder to do now because of biometric technology. So it makes it hard to travel undercover.
Social media,
facial recognition, all that sort of stuff makes it very hard. So, these sort of situations do make it easier for Western intelligence when you get a walk-in. And in fact, I think there was years ago, I read a book by Stephen Gray, and it was, I can't remember what it was called now. It was a really good book. And it was all about, it was sort of like a kind of contemporary history of espionage over the last 30 years. And there was a Cold War warrior of the CIA he was speaking to, I think it was Milt Bearden, was said that really, he said most spy stories are locker room talk, and the majority of spies that the West ran were walk-ins.
Yep.
And honestly, when you think about the smoke and mirrors world of espionage, I think you do want an ideologically motivated spy because it probably makes them more reliable. If you compromise someone, they're probably going to try and find a way to screw you over. If you just it's just financial, I don't know, then that person probably is going to want to go to other people too for money.
Yeah.
So if somebody's really psychologically motivated, I think that probably makes them more reliable. And I think of all the great spy stories that we've mentioned and great spies that we mentioned, I think they've all been ideologically motivated. So there definitely is something in that, definitely. And in fact, that might segue nicely, unless there's anything else you want to add to this, into just a few recent spy stories. So there's a really interesting article on the BBC at the moment by Gordon Corera, who's the BBC security correspondent and former guest on this show, and really another top person to keep an eye on Twitter or on the BBC. So there's a trial going on at the Old Bailey in London at the moment involving a gentleman named David Smith. And David Smith was a security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin, and he was arrested in May 2020. And his trial's just sort of happening now. And prosecutors said he was driven by an intense hatred for his country and angered by the flying of rainbow flags in support of the LGBTQ+ community. And so this, to me, is a guy who seems really on board with Russia's sort of stance in the world today. He strikes me as somebody who was ideologically motivated to work for Russia. This individual, he was arrested and he had £700 of cash in his home in Potsdam, Germany, which isn't a lot of money, but
No.
The information he passed on, he didn't have access to classified or top secret information, but he did have access to CCTV and logs of people coming in and out of the embassy, and that makes it easy for Russian intelligence to identify intelligence officers working at the embassy, and so that could have helped the Russians with their operations against the embassy in Germany. So it's a very interesting one, that one. I don't know, Matt, if there was anything that struck you with that, or if you had any thoughts on that case.
Yeah, again, classic sort of ideological motivation, of course, from the inverse.
Yeah.
We're talking about people before who get sort of turned off by Russia and they spy against Russia. This is sort of the opposite, that someone, who had sort of, I guess I'll say, right-wing views to the extent that they motivated him to sort of sell out his country to the Russians. I'm just quoting here. He is said to have wanted to live in Russia or Ukraine during the time he passed on secret intelligence from May 2020. So Okay.
I'm assuming he'd watched a lot of Russia Today, because I remember when I used to briefly watch it about 10 years ago. Russia Today is full of documentaries about America's failures in Vietnam, America's sort of failures socially, and then lots of documentaries about how pretty Russia is, with lots of lovely pictures of mountains and, So I wondered if he had this on a loop in the background. He was like, oh my goodness, that mountain, maybe I could get a
Probably.
dacha, in this wonderful Russia that's very anti, because again, he seems to be very right-wing, and I could speculate to say he's probably anti-woke, because there's sort of an anti-woke hysteria that's been online for a good few years now.
Yeah.
And I suspect that this individual, Mr. Smith, is probably very much into that online hysteria against progressive values and things.
Yeah. So he is on trial at the Old Bailey right now.
That's it.
And faces a maximum of 14 years in prison for violations of the Official Secrets Act.
Now, in fact, in comparison to Americans, that's quite a light sentence, because in the US, they end up in a supermax, sometimes in solitary confinement, usually for 25 plus years.
That's where Robert Hansen is. Yeah. Colorado Supermax, which is essentially like a dungeon. You don't want to go there.
No. You'd almost argue the death penalty might be nicer. But I don't
probably know. There's some U.S. prisons are really not good. But yeah, Robert Hansen, I know, is in Florence Supermax right now for the rest of his life. Arguably, probably where Snowden would go if he was brought back here. That strikes me as 14 years is a bit of a lesser. Yeah, that's definitely way less than he would face here. We put you away for a while.
Yeah, I don't think in the UK we have a brilliant track record with regards to imprisoning traitors. We either let them go or give them really weak ass sentences usually, but
I'm not saying, I mean, for the record, I'm not saying that this guy should be put away for the rest of his life. I don't have a particular feeling on either way. British magistrates can do with this what they should under British law. But yeah.
Yeah. It does seem kind of light, but
yeah.
But there we go. On more Russian espionage, I think today's theme is now that 2 Swedish brothers have been charged for spying for Russia, and they've been spying for Russia for over 10 years. There's 2 brothers, one Payman Kier, 42 years old, and then Payam Kier, the younger brother, 35 years old, and they've been passing secrets to the Russian military intelligence service, the GRU. And one of the brothers was trying to destroy a hard drive as the other brother was arrested. So that's a really, really good move.
That's not good. You don't want to get caught doing that.
No.
As the police break down the door.
No, exactly. And I heard the arrest was quite dramatic. It involved helicopters and stuff. There was some stuff on Twitter about it and things. Yeah. So it's quite an interesting one. So I mean, 10 years as a mole was a long time. And I'm imagining they've done quite a lot of damage because they were, really quite senior in Swedish security services in the early days of their career. And I do wonder whether they had access to information that's been shared from allied intelligence services. So yeah, it's an intriguing one, that one. So that's a story that will probably, be developing over time. So keep an eye out for that one. But Matt, was there anything you wanted to add to that? Or?
No, just again, another situation in the last couple months of Russian spies getting rolled up. I mean, in the next 10 to 15 years, there's going to be a massive 700-page book. I'm thinking about that book on Mossad, Rise and Kill First. That's right over my shoulder back here. 700 pages long. Whole chronicle of the history of the Mossad. We're going to have something like that about Western intelligence efforts against the Russians during the war in Ukraine, and it's going to be astounding, and it's going to be full of stuff like this and a lot of stuff that we don't even know about.
I'm going to make a bet now. Michael Weiss will be writing it.
Yeah, I think there will be a race to get several. I mean, you think like after the Bin Laden raid.
Oh yeah,
there were several sort of competing books. But one of them will stand out. Someone who, I don't know, if you're getting invited to Tallinn by the head of Estonian intelligence, you probably have some good contacts.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to quickly chat about these PIs that have been hired by China and Iran in America. Because in the UK at the moment, we've had the head of MI5 just gave a speech where he outlined there had been 10 plots involving kidnapping and death threats to Iranians in the UK from the Iranian intelligence services. And then there's another article that just recently came out with the New York Times about how China and Iran have been hiring American private investigators to spy on dissidents in the US. So pretty much the title says what happened there. So there's a private investigator called Michael McKeever who was who unwittingly hired to watch an Iranian dissident, and unknown to him, the FBI were also watching this person, and the FBI then contacted Mr. McKeever to say that his clients were not who they thought they were, and went on to say that they're bad people and they're up to no good. And the FBI have now issued an alert to private investigators across America to warn them about how they could potentially be hired by hostile intelligence services, Chinese and Iranian in particular. So, that kind of follows in quite nicely with what we were talking about last month with these sort of secret Chinese police stations that were popping up. So, I don't know, Matt, was there anything you had any thoughts on with that? But I thought it was quite an interesting story, that one.
Yeah, it reminds me of what we talked about the Chinese police stations. It also honestly reminds me of the former RAF pilots.
Oh, yeah.
Chinese fighter pilots.
Yeah.
To the extent that, like, should American nationals be allowed to basically act as subcontractors for Chinese and Iranian intelligence? I think no. I mean, I think this sort of seems, the article reads like they were basically giving these PIs a defensive briefing, which is to like pull them aside and be like, so for listeners, a defensive briefing is like if you're being targeted by a foreign intelligence service, either for recruitment or blackmail, coercion, some kind of thing like that, and you're unaware of it, like you're not cooperating with them, you don't even know, the FBI will pull you aside for a defensive briefing and say, hey, just so you want to know, just so you know, we've collected this information that, X hostile country is out for you in this regard, and be careful. I think Trump was given one of these defensive briefings during the 2016 campaign, and famously we know how that went.
Yeah, I think Comey gave it to him. Yeah.
Right. So this seems to me kind of like the same thing. It's like this line here, your client is not who you think they are. The agent said, according to Mr. McKeever, they are bad people and they're up to no good. So I'm sure it's not someone, a clear Chinese intelligence officer who's approaching you and saying, hey, do you want to spy for the Ministry of State Security against Chinese dissidents? There's various levels of intermediaries and stuff. But yeah, I mean, what I thought of, like with the former RAF pilots training the Chinese, it's something that is not illegal under the letter of the law, but it's one of those things that like it should be.
Yeah.
And it feels like it will be in the future because of this stuff. It's like, okay, you as a private investigator have to do your due diligence to know who you're working for. And if, prosecutors can prove that you didn't, then you can be charged for espionage. I mean, why not?
Yeah. Well, our laws are still so messed up where even people who fly out to Syria to fight for ISIS can still come home and not necessarily be charged for it.
Yeah.
I think it's because with that situation, it's very hard to prove in a court of law what those people did. We kind of know what they did.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to then prove it.
Right. Under like the standards of evidence of like we think you probably beheaded someone, but we don't have the evidence that would stand up in a courtroom.
Yeah. And I'm not a legal expert. And I must try and chat to somebody at some point about this because it's something that really interests me. It's just like there's got to be some way where maybe in those cases you have to flip it around, and so the person has to prove they weren't up to no good. But but that's I'm not a legal expert, so I'm sure there'll be some lawyers going, "What the boop?" But
Well, again, I'm not a legal expert by any means, also, but I'm thinking like, okay, if the State Department or the Foreign Office puts out a notice, which they do often, like various countries, like if you're an American or a British citizen, do not travel to Syria for these reasons.
Yes.
And then if then this official notice has been put out, and there aren't like U.S. or British, like U.S. Airways, British Airlines is not flying into Damascus anymore, and it's found that you went anyway to this country, like you have to prove why you were there and what you were doing there. Otherwise, you
get a mandatory 10-year sentence for bad behavior. I don't know. Yeah, maybe there's some way they can do it where if you violate that notice, you get I don't know, a 10-year sentence or something, which could be bigger.
Right.
Or something like that. I don't know. Not an automatic death penalty. I think that'd be a bit extreme.
Just, no.
On the death penalty, no. On one last thing I wanted to mention, because we were talking about human intelligence earlier, and obviously signals intelligence and intelligence from satellites, I think, have been a great advantage to America and the West for quite some time, and aerial reconnaissance too. And allegedly, China have now got a satellite hunting radar called the SLC-18, and it can detect satellites from a distance and identify and categorize them to form a radar database and then help the Chinese respond accordingly. And apparently this technology could also then be exported to countries like Pakistan, Iran, and North Korea, all great fun places. And so this technology, I suppose, represents a threat now to, you know, that American sort of dominance with satellites and so on. And I can only assume that part of the reason why Space Force was created was potentially anticipating something like this. And I know the Space Force have a secretive space shuttle called the X-37B that has been going on quite a few secret missions over the last few years. And if you look at a website called the Drive/Warzone, they've certainly been sort of talking about the X-37B. It's quite an advanced piece of kit. So yeah, so in a world of where human intelligence is getting harder, now signals intelligence potentially is as well, and satellite reconnaissance, and that's worrying. But I don't know. I'm assuming the Americans, you guys have probably got something up your sleeves, but I don't know. What do you think on that?
Yeah. So the issue here is if it gets exported to like North Korea. So let's say the North Koreans are doing activities at a nuclear site or something, and they have this radar system that tells us when U.S. spy satellites are, or specifically which U.S. spy satellites are going to be overhead at what time. So you know, okay, there's an NRO bird in low Earth orbit way up there. We know at this time not to do anything at this nuclear site. So that's sort of the issue there. And then you think, well, okay, well, couldn't you just move the orbit of the satellite? And you can, but Patriot Games sort of famously was an early example of what I'm about to get into here. You can move the orbital path of a satellite, but it uses the onboard fuel, which is, of course, limited supply up there, and it reduces the service life of the satellites doing that. So you want to do it really sparingly. It's a really big deal. They did it in Patriot Games to find the IRA cell there in Libya. So this is sort of the same concern. I mean, do we have countermeasures against this? Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know what they are.
Yeah.
And
stealth satellites.
No one. Right. Yeah. No, that's a common thing that's been developed by the NRO. I mean, you think this is probably the most sensitive area of the U.S. intelligence community. I mean, the NRO, before it was its own, that's the National Reconnaissance Office, which builds and manages U.S. spy satellites. And the NGA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, analyzes a lot of the data that they get. That's sort of the difference between those two agencies. For the beginning of the NRO's life, it was sort of a joint office run between the U.S. Air Force and the CIA before it became its own separate agency. And for a long time, I want to say well into the 90s, it wasn't even disclosed that the NRO even existed. Super classified organization. It's still rumored. I mentioned it in Active Measures Part 2, the novel I'm still working on. I gave it a name drop that there's sort of an underwater equivalent to the NRO, the National Underwater Reconnaissance Office, that is still like totally classified. You're not even supposed to know that it exists. But yeah, this is like the most sensitive area of the U.S. intelligence community. And are there countermeasures to this? Probably. I don't know what it is, to your point that Space Force has that sort of special space shuttle that's lurking up there doing something. I would say that this is more of an issue in peacetime than it is during an actual shooting war, because a radar site having this thing on the ground would be blown up in like the first half hour.
Yeah, totally.
You know?
Totally. I'm glad we got a chance to chat about it, because it's one to keep an eye on as well. Be interesting to see if it does get exported to other countries. So shall we move on to spy entertainment?
Yeah, we'll do Andor.
Andor,
And then
yeah.
Spy Among Friends, which
yeah,
is
yeah. Well,
okay.
I suppose with Spy Among Friends, there's not a lot to say other than there's a new show coming out based on the book by Ben McIntyre called Spy Among Friends. It's coming out in the UK on the 8th of December on ITVX and BritBox and on MGM Plus at some point in 2023. So again, get yourself a VPN and watch it on ITV for free. But it's all about Kim Philby and his friendship with a fellow MI6 officer, Nicholas Elliott. And Nicholas Elliott was famous for interviewing Kim Philby on the day he managed to defect in Beirut.
That's the Cambridge spy ring, right?
Yeah, Cambridge spy ring. Yeah. Nicholas Elliott is an interesting one. I don't know. I judge him a bit. I feel he's a bit of a twit. But
How
there
so?
we go. Well, there's a there's an incident involving a British diver called Buster Crabbe. I don't know if you're familiar with this story. I don't think I've heard of that. And this is the British diver who snuck under a Russian ship in Portsmouth and then disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and only for his headless body to be discovered, I think, a year later.
Oh.
And Nicholas Elliott was the one running him. And obviously the Russians were aware of this operation, which makes you think that either Kim Philby was aware of this operation, or Nicholas Elliott may or may not have, I don't know, maybe in cahoots with Russia as well.
Interesting.
Because he was the last man to see Kim Philby before he defected. So my counterintelligence, with no experience, no physical experience, my counterintelligence kind of radar is a bit like, this is suspicious.
Yeah, that's odd.
So they were good friends. They were very good friends, apparently, and apparently it's their friendship that blinded them. I'm less convinced of that personally, but I can't back that up with any evidence. And Ben McIntyre, who's a historian and much more successful than I am, has come up with a much more compelling story. So Spy Among Friends will be coming out shortly. Definitely worth a watch. It's got some great actors in it, and I think it's going to be a pretty well-made show. So let's move on to Andor. So if anybody listening to this has not seen Andor, I suggest you pause now, tweet about how great this episode was, and then come back and listen later.
Yes.
Because we're going to get into some spoiler territory. Well, at least Matt probably is. Because I only just finished Andor, and it's still a bit fresh in my head in certain places and a bit fuzzy in others, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it. There's some really cool sort of espionage tradecraft stuff going on. And Stellan Skarsgård is a great actor.
Plays Luthen.
He's the man. If I could have made the Oleg Gordievsky story about 15 years ago, he's the guy I would have cast as Oleg Gordievsky. He's such a great actor.
He'd be great. He'd be great.
Yeah, he's probably a bit old for the character now, but I think Stellan Skarsgård's fantastic. So anyway, Andor, what do you give us your thoughts on that?
I mean, I've been a Star Wars fan since I was a wee lad. Mm-hmm. My mom took me to see the special editions when they were put out in theaters. I think I was 7 when the first one, A New Hope, came back out. And that was sort of my introduction to it. I've been a fan of it ever since. And it's, I mean, I was very happy to see the Star Wars universe treated as a prestige HBO drama. I mean, to me, I think the world is big enough. The Star Wars world is big enough. And now that you have a bunch of Disney money behind it, you have the space where, you can do more sort of goofy, fun kid stuff like the Boba Fett show. And that's great. And that's valid. And there's room for that. And there's room for these people who have grown up with Star Wars who are now adults who want more sort of serious kind of fare, And if you think about this huge franchise, I mean, Star Wars is for kids, but I mean, it's also for everyone too. I mean, kids don't spend $600 on a replica lightsaber. Kids don't spend multiple thousands of dollars to go to Disney World, on vacation. So I think it's good to have that sort of diversity. And we got that. And I think it just goes to show what sort of a story you can tell in that world when you put competent people with really good taste, like Tony Gilroy, who did, a lot of the Bourne movies.
And Michael Clayton, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, he did. He did Michael Clayton too. And Beirut, that movie with John Hamm.
I like Beirut actually, but
I liked it too. I liked it too. You want to talk about spies, how good spies are recruited and motivated by ideology and come to that conclusion that they're going to put their life on the line for something greater than themselves and really believe in it.
Mm.
You know, Andor shows that fully. You know, we're talking about Stellan Skarsgård's character, Luthen, or even how Andor, Diego Luna's character, sort of over the course of the show comes to accept his place in this rebellion that's breaking out across the galaxy. Really kind of fascinating stuff. And I think the show does a great job of showing the banality of evil in the Empire, in the Empire's intelligence services, you know? Yeah, Gilroy's definitely read Eichmann in Jerusalem, the way it just depicts these people who are just doing their job, you know, who aren't evil, so to speak, but are furthering a fascist cause nonetheless, and how they allow themselves to sort of detach, to sort of take that part of their brain out that thinks I'm complicit in this awful thing and think I'm just working for the Imperial Standards and Measurements Office.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I'm just a guy in a chair who just takes orders. You know, you really sort of see that well.
I love Cyril.
Yeah, he was the corporate security officer who then that raid goes bad. And
yeah. Cyril's such an interesting character who, basically got the shit for an operation going wrong. But was still very obsessive and had a real strong sense of, I suppose, justice from his point of view. And just couldn't give up and gone to great personal risk to try and find Cassian Andor. And I thought he was really interesting. And obviously Stellan Skarsgård as Luthien Rule, who, is the head of... Is he the head of the Resistance? He's sort of a key figure in the Resistance, isn't he?
He's sort of the head of a very prominent rebel cell at this point, you know. And then, but that monologue from him, I think it's at the end of episode 10, where there's a mole inside the Imperial Security Bureau who comes to sort of tell him, like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. I have a family. And in the most threatening way that never actually contains an overt threat, says, like, you're going nowhere. There's that monologue that ends with, like, I need all the heroes I can get.
Yeah.
Some of the most brilliant writing in Star Wars.
And nice tradecraft too, because he had to go into a lift to get a Bluetooth earpiece to then plug it into his ear to then, for Stellan Skarsgård starts talking to him. I always love those kind of things. Something
else to your point there that I really like what the show does. It shows that real sense of personal danger that you undertake in rebelling, in conducting intelligence operations against this huge, all-knowing fascistic regime. You know, that, like, there's lines where it talks about, you know, like, sending and receiving messages is incredibly dangerous, you know, and you don't do it without intent and care and cause, you know. Like, when Cassian comes in to the heist on Aldhani for the Imperial base, like, the rest of the crew is like, I don't really know who this guy is, and I don't know if I want you here. Like, it's treated in a serious way that, like, this is life and death, you know, like, it's not a game. And I just love to see that done in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. And if anything, I mean, it's one of the better spy dramas out of all the current crop of spy dramas, if you want to put it in that category. Yeah.
Oh yeah, like it's not just a good Star Wars show. It's a good show, period.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's much. Yeah. It just, what other shows make easy, it makes it very hard. So yeah, like the Covert Contacts and stuff like that. I liked it a lot for that. And I think I said this before, the music is so effective in that show. It kind of, I'm a big fan of the Battlestar Galactica remake that came out in the early 2000s. And it was sort of reminding me a little bit of that, the feeling of the show very much felt a bit like that, sort of, not the 70s Battlestar Galactica, which I think most people would like to forget, but the early 2000s one was really good. Allegedly, they're trying to remake that, which is a bit sad, but there we go. But that was a great show. And I remember, have you seen Battlestar Galactica?
No. I have not. I should, but I haven't.
Well, do check it out if you get a chance. If anything, the mini-series is fantastic, and the mini-series really caught that post 9/11 feel really well and very effectively. And then I think it's season 3. They kind of turn, bit of a spoiler, but they kind of end up in a situation where we deal with a rebellion. And it was at the time the Iraq War was going on, and so you could say it was quite subversive in some ways as TV, but it kind of made you understand how rebellions work and why they happen and so on. And you had a bit of is it green on blue attacks where somebody posing as a police officer goes and kills other police officers or military people, stuff like that. That kind of stuff was going on in that show. So definitely, if you haven't seen Battlestar Galactica, the early 2000s one, not the 70s one, check it out.
There are a few other podcasts that I've listened to that have Tony Gilroy on and talking through the show. And in one of them, he had a note where he talked about how he studied how rebel leaders often start out as really great, inspirational, awesome figures. Like he used Mao and even Stalin early on as an example. Like the rebel heist in Aldani was based on a real life heist that Stalin did in Georgia in the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution. Talk about how these larger than life figures sort of start out in really sort of inspirational ways and then often somewhat go bad, you know, going back to the examples of Mao and Stalin. And I think that sort of tells us where he's probably going with Luthen Stellan Skarsgård's character in season 2.
Yeah, I can see that, because it was me thinking as well, like it was sort of, there's a Bin Laden feeling about him.
Sure. Yeah.
And that made me uncomfortable a little bit. It was just like,
I think that's a perfectly fair comparison, you know, and I think it's probably intentional. You know, I mean, we consider Bin Laden a terrorist. There's a lot of people out there who consider him a rebel. You know, it's very much depends on who you, on what side of the coin you're looking at. And if you're writing these kind of characters, I mean, I do it with the Active Measures novels. You know, I don't, if I'm dealing with an IRGC officer or someone, you know, I don't write them like, haha, here's my scowling villain. You know, to them, they're the hero, they're the good guy. And when you're in that scene with this character and you're trying to show the audience the world through their eyes, you have to look at them that way. And I think it just comes across as a more realistic depiction of humanity. Yeah,
indeed. And it's I suppose there's a warning in it, isn't it? Because like it's all about this idea of a greater good, and that can corrupt people occasionally, can't it?
Sure.
So you've got to be really careful with you know, doing bad things in the name of a greater good.
Yeah.
One other thought just popped into my head as you were talking about Stalin. I was watching some World War II in colour documentary with my wife, and they showed a historic picture of Stalin from his younger years. And my wife said, God, he was quite hot, wasn't he?
He was.
So apparently Stalin was hot.
He was, yeah. I've seen that picture.
Yeah, because it's on the cover of a biography of him, isn't it? He's got a sort of like moustache and things, and so Stalin was hot. There we are.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Well, we probably should wrap up. But Christmas is coming up, and
it is.
You got any interesting plans for Christmas? Any films? I noticed you've got a Die Hard kind of advent calendar.
Oh yeah, you noticed that. Yeah. So if you're listening at home and can't actually see us talking, on the bookcase over my shoulder there is an advent calendar, and it's Nakatomi Tower from Die Hard, and at the top of it there's a little tiny Hans Gruber, and we're recording this on December 1st. So Hans Gruber is beginning his 25-day descent to the bottom of Nakatomi Tower, and every day I'll bring him down a little bit.
It's brilliant.
Yeah,
it's brilliant. And oh man, yeah. No, I've been to Fox Plaza, that was the Nakatomi building, and in fact, there's a really great shopping centre in Century City now. We get an amazing view of the building. Yeah. So last Christmas, I was in the States and did my pilgrimage to the Nakatomi building just to, see it. Because I do love Die Hard. It's one of my favourite Christmas movies. I know there's a debate about whether it is or isn't a Christmas movie. To me, it is. As is some Lethal Weapon to some extent, but I've kind of gone off Mel Gibson these days. But
yeah, probably smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, December is always sort of a crazy month for me. I mean, my birthday is on the 15th.
Oh, brilliant! Well, happy birthday in advance.
Thank you. And the last couple of years, I was in grad school, so it's always like right in the middle of finals week too. You know. And this is the first year in a while that I don't have that.
Yeah.
So that'll be a fun month. Do you have anything interesting going on?
Well, I've suddenly got a lot of work, which is good.
Good.
Yeah, it's been kind of crazy. But no, so I'm spending time with my father-in-law and my sister-in-law, and potentially my wife's cousins on Christmas Day for a nice lunch. One of my wife's cousins is a really good cook, so I'm looking forward to that potentially. Hopefully, I've always found in the last few years, especially as a sort of film freelancer and stuff, it's very sometimes difficult to take time off and have proper time off, because usually as a freelancer, you spend half your time off worrying about, will I ever work again and stuff like that. So it kind of becomes a buzzkill. And certainly I had a bit of a summer a bit like that. And as relaxing as my summer was, it wasn't fully relaxing. But what I like about Christmas, it really is relaxing generally if you embrace it, because most of the world just shuts down during that time and no one cares.
Yeah.
And very rarely does anybody chase you for anything during those 2 weeks. And it's very rare that you get 2 weeks when no one's chasing you about something. So in probably the last 10 years or so, I've kind of religiously taken Christmas off just to wind down and get a proper chill out period. So I generally watch lots of movies. Last year I did a bit of a Michael Mann bender. I'm kind of in the mood for another Michael Mann bender, to be honest. I don't know why, but in fact there's a cinema near me that's doing a Michael Mann-a-thon where you can spend 600 minutes watching quite a few Michael Mann films in succession. And I love Michael Mann, but I don't think I could spend 600 minutes in a cinema overnight watching, what is it? It's Thief, Manhunter, which I love, Heat I love, then it's Collateral and Miami Vice. And I love all those films, but I just don't see myself being able to sit in a cinema. I could see myself at home doing that over a few days, but not in one sitting.
Yeah. I think if I saw that Heat was playing in a cinema, I would have to drop everything to go see it. Just get the chance to see it on a big screen. Yeah.
We have this wonderful cinema in London called the Prince Charles. Prince Charles cinema is in Leicester Square, and they show older movies, and the Heat comes on fairly regularly now, especially the definitive edition of it as well. And honestly, I went to see it not long ago in about May time in the cinema, and it was the first time I'd seen it in the cinema since it came out. Because Heat, for me, when I first saw that in the cinema in the 90s, really just, I don't know, it just was a bit of a game changer for me personally. I loved that film. I was still trying to work out if it's my favourite Michael Mann movie, but I love it. I think it's Michael Mann's best movie. Whether it's my favourite, I'm still not sure, because I do love Manhunter.
That firefight, that bank heist is, I would argue, still to this day, the best firefight ever put on screen ever. And it's the sound that does it.
It's the sound and it's the tactics, because I find a lot of movies just get into generic action where somebody in the decision-making process either just doesn't have any actual knowledge of how these things happen or doesn't have an interest. And it tends to lead to very bland, or they break the laws of physics and start doing really stupid things which no human being can do. And it's always those two things that disappoint me in an action sequence. So I think Heat is fantastic. And I think probably Ronin, the 1998 film's got some really great action in it as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's a good one too. I haven't seen that in years.
That's set at Christmas. Is that a Christmas movie? Probably not, but it is set at Christmas. So, it's a good film too. But there we go. Well, I wish you happy holidays and a happy birthday. And
you as well.
Thank you for joining me. And we'll be back in January. And between now and then, figure out whether we'll have a busy December to talk about, or whether we might try and do a recap of the year. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But there we go.
Hopefully a lot of spies don't get arrested over Christmas.
Well, yeah, especially during the 2-week period I try and chill out. The world's going to stop for those 2 weeks. Cool. Thanks, Matt. Take care.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.